Imagine paying for the best seat on the plane, first class, front row, and when you arrive, a stranger is already sitting there. Now imagine that stranger looks you straight in the eye and says, "People like you don't belong here." That's exactly what happened to Camille Davis, a black CEO on her way to close the biggest deal of her career. The attendants hesitated, the passengers stayed silent, and in that moment, Camille realized she wasn't just fighting for a seat, she was fighting for her dignity. What happened next was so shocking. The entire flight never even left the ground. "You don't belong here." The words hit Camille Davis harder than the cold air conditioning blowing through the cabin. Her hand trembled as she held out her boarding pass, the bold black letters of 1A shining clearly under the cabin lights. Yet the man seated there, his white shirt unbuttoned, just enough to show arrogance more than comfort, didn't so much as glance at it. Bradley Stone, broad-shouldered and flushed from champagne, leaned back against the leather seat, as if the entire row were his birthright. A lazy smirk tugged at his lips, and he raised his glass in a silent toast of mockery. "Sweetheart, maybe try coach," he added under his breath, not even giving her the dignity of eye contact. Camille's throat burned, but not with words of anger. She had spent too many years mastering her silence, choosing when to speak, when to hold steady. That control had carried her through boardrooms filled with men just like him. It had built her company, earned her contracts that reshaped the industry, and it had bought this ticket her seat. She stood her ground, boarding pass steady in her hand. Yet the flight attendant, Kelly Moore, shifted uneasily beside Bradley, her smile stiff, her eyes flickering away from Camille's face. "Perhaps we should just recheck the system," Kelly murmured, as though the paper in Camille's hand wasn't proof enough. The air in first class shifted, conversations hushed. Phones hovered a little higher. Strangers' eyes slid toward her but never stayed long enough to lend support. Whispers began, like the rustle of dry leaves, each one cutting deeper. "Is she lost? Did she sneak up here?" Camille felt the sting of isolation, the heavy press of being judged, measured, and already dismissed. She wasn't just a woman standing in the aisle. She was a black woman being told in subtle and unsubtle ways that she didn't belong. "Excuse me," Camille said evenly, though her heart pounded. "This is my seat. 1A, paid for, confirmed." Her voice carried the kind of calm only years of practice could build. But Bradley's smirk widened, his hand waving dismissively at Kelly. "She's mistaken," he said, as though Camille weren't even there. "Handle this, will you?" The sting of humiliation rippled through her chest, but Camille's spine stayed straight. She had faced worse storms than this, though never so publicly. The carpet beneath her shoes suddenly felt like quicksand, threatening to swallow her if she faltered, and as the silence dragged, she realized something with icy clarity. This wasn't about a seat, this was about power. She thought back to the airport only an hour before, the security officer who lingered over her ID a little too long, the curious stares when she walked through the terminal in her tailored navy suit, her laptop bag slung neatly over her shoulder. It was always there, the invisible barrier that followed her, the unspoken suspicion that success looked like someone else. And now, as Bradley lounged in her place, she was staring at the same wall, just built higher and thicker. Kelly cleared her throat. "Ma'am, if you'll just wait at the gate, we can." The words landed like stones, heavier than Bradley's mockery. Wait at the gate, with her ticket in hand, her name on the manifest. Camille's chest rose, her breath sharp against the silence. "You're asking me to leave my seat," she said softly, her eyes locking onto Kelly's. The attendant faltered, her professional smile trembling. For the first time, Kelly looked unsettled, as though she'd realized what she was about to enforce. But before she could answer, Bradley leaned forward, his smirk stretching into a grin. "Seems simple enough. Coach is that way." The audacity of his voice, laced with casual cruelty, cut the air. Someone coughed nervously. Another passenger shifted uncomfortably in their seat. No one spoke. No one stood. Camille felt the weight of dozens of eyes pressing her down, silently calculating whether her presence was worth defending. and not one voice rose for her. Her fingers clenched around the boarding pass until the edges bit into her skin. She thought of her employees, of the expansion meeting she was flying to lead tomorrow. She thought of the years she had clawed her way upward, brick by brick against doubters and doors slammed in her face. And now, here she was, on the brink of being erased with a smirk and a shrug. But she would not move. Not tonight. Not here. Camille lifted her chin, her voice calm, measured, undeniable. I am not leaving my seat. Bradley chuckled, sipping the last of his champagne. We'll see about that. The attendant's radio crackled softly. The tension in the air thickened, pressing down on every passenger. Phones tilted higher. Fingers hovered, ready to capture what might come next. And as Kelly exchanged a nervous glance with her colleague, Hannah Reed, Camille knew the battle had only just begun. The silence in the cabin seemed to stretch forever, broken only by the faint clinking of glasses and the low hum of the engines waiting to roar. Camille Davis didn't lower her hand, though the boarding pass now trembled between her fingers. The ache in her chest wasn't just anger, it was a familiar weariness, the kind that came from years of walking into rooms where she had to prove her worth before she was allowed to simply exist. She had built her company from scratch, fought for contracts that others whispered were impossible, and turned a small tech startup into a powerhouse trusted by corporations across the coast. That seat, 1A, was more than a number printed on a card. It was a quiet symbol of everything she had worked for, every barrier she had broken. But Bradley Stone didn't see that. He saw only what he wanted to see, a woman, a black woman, standing in front of him with a claim he could dismiss with a wave of his hand. His confidence was as heavy as the glass of champagne he cradled, and his voice dripped with entitlement as he leaned back further. We don't need troublemakers in first class, he muttered, loud enough for the rows behind to hear. A chuckle floated from somewhere nearby, quickly smothered when Camille's eyes flickered in its direction. The sound cut her deeper than any insult could, not because she cared about their laughter, but because it revealed the quiet permission people gave to cruelty when they didn't want to get involved. Kelly Moore, shifting from foot to foot, glanced nervously at the tablet in her hand. Ma'am, the system isn't showing your name here right now, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking softly would make the injustice less sharp. Camille reached into her bag with deliberate calm and produced the confirmation email, her company's name stamped in bold at the top. Everything is here. Verified, paid, cleared. Her tone was steady, but her eyes betrayed the storm rising inside her. She wasn't asking for kindness, only for fairness, but fairness in moments like these felt as distant as the stars outside the small oval windows. Passengers began to fidget, some pulling out their phones as though truth could only exist if captured on a screen. Yet even as digital witnesses flickered to life, no one stood beside her. The isolation pressed harder. Memory surfaced her first major pitch when a senior partner asked if she was here to take notes. The bank officer who had assumed her father must have been the real owner of her company, the countless small indignities that had shaped her into the woman she was today. And now, here she was again, fighting not for $1 billion deal, but for a seat she had already earned. Hannah Reed joined Kelly, her expression tight, her voice clipped with forced politeness. Ma'am, we'll need you to step aside for just a few minutes while we resolve this. The words were coated in sugar, but felt like glass scraping against Camille's dignity. Step aside, always wait while others decided whether she belonged. Bradley's smirk widened, as if the flight attendant's hesitation was proof of his superiority. He reached for another glass poured quickly by the crew, his satisfaction spilling heavier than the bubbles in the drink. Camille drew a long breath, her voice rising just enough to reach the surrounding passengers without breaking. I am not moving. This is my seat. Her tone wasn't loud, but it carried the kind of weight that made even the most distracted ears listen. Still, no one defended her. The discomfort in the cabin had become a living thing, crawling across every row. People avoided her eyes as though meeting them would demand their courage. Kelly looked over her shoulder, whispering into her radio, and Camille caught the words that made her pulse quicken, requesting assistance. Possible escalation. Escalation, as if her insistence on dignity was a threat. Her hands tightened around the boarding pass, the paper crumpling at the edges. A sharp ache ran through her chest, not from fear of the officers she knew would come, but from the crushing knowledge that even with proof in her hand, she could still be erased with a single decision. Bradley chuckled again, crossing his legs with lazy arrogance. "Best listen to them, sweetheart," he sneered, his voice carrying the calm of a man who had never once questioned whether he belonged anywhere. He spoke like someone who believed the world existed for him, who believed people like Camille were simply intruders to be brushed aside. The flight attendants shifted again, tension threading through their movements. A ripple of unease passed through the cabin. Camille didn't move. She thought of her employees waiting for her tomorrow, the deal she was about to secure, the responsibility she carried not just for herself, but for everyone who looked up to her. She thought of the little girl she once was, told she was aiming too high, and the promise she had made to prove them all wrong. And as the weight of silence pressed heavier, Camille realized this wasn't just another moment of disrespect. It was a test of how many times she could be told to shrink and still choose to rise. She straightened her shoulders, looked Bradley directly in the eye, and said once more, steady as stone, "This is my seat, and I will not leave it." In that instant, the cabin shifted again, not in support, not yet, but in recognition. The quiet battle between arrogance and dignity was no longer invisible. It was on display for every passenger to witness. And as the sound of heavy footsteps echoed closer from the jet bridge, Camille knew the next moment would decide not just her fate, but the message the entire flight would carry into the sky. The footsteps grew louder, firm and deliberate against the carpeted jet bridge, and Camille felt her stomach tighten. She had known this moment was coming the moment Kelly whispered into the radio, but the reality of it hit harder when two uniformed security officers appeared in the aisle. Their presence shifted the air instantly. Passengers straightened in their seats. The hum of whispers rose, and every pair of eyes locked on Camille as though she were already guilty of something. She stood tall, boarding pass still in her hand, but the weight pressing down on her was heavy enough to suffocate. Bradley Stone didn't miss a beat. He leaned back in her seat, a self-satisfied grin spreading wider across his face, as though reinforcements had arrived just to defend him. "About time," he muttered, lifting his glass in mock salute. The sight of him lounging comfortably while she stood in humiliation made Camille's chest ache. It wasn't fear she felt. It was exhaustion, the kind that comes from fighting to exist where others take their place for granted. The first officer, tall and broad with a practiced calmness, addressed her quietly. "Ma'am, we need to de-escalate the situation. Could you please step aside while we sort this out?" His tone was firm, but his eyes never lingered long enough to see her humanity. She extended her boarding pass once more, her voice steady though her hands trembled slightly. "This is my assigned seat. 1A. Purchased. Confirmed. Documented." She even raised her phone with the email glowing on the screen. Yet, the officer's gaze slid past the proof as though it were nothing but a distraction. Kelly Moore stood nearby, her face tight with discomfort, while Hannah Reed shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Their silence was sharper than Bradley's insults. It told Camille everything. How easy it was for people to watch, to let her fight alone, to avoid discomfort by stepping back. Whispers ran along the rows like an electric current. "What's happening? Is she not supposed to be here?" The sting of those murmurs cut deeper than the officer's words. It was the sound of strangers deciding her worth with every glance, every half-hidden smirk. Bradley leaned forward, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Look, sweetheart. It's simple. Just move. You're holding up everyone else." His words were a knife, sharp and casual, and Camille's body tensed, but she did not move. Her jaw tightened as she whispered back, "I am not leaving." The officers exchanged a glance, one reaching gently but firmly for her arm, that touch cold, dismissive, unwarranted, ignited a storm inside her. She pulled back, her eyes blazing with a calm fury that made even the nearest passengers flinch. You will not remove me from the seat I paid for. You will not erase me like I do not exist. Her voice, though not raised, carried through the cabin like a blade slicing through fog. Phones tilted higher now. The glow of screens reflected on faces frozen between discomfort and fascination. Some passengers looked away, unwilling to be witnesses. Others watched with silent curiosity, as though her pain were part of the entertainment of travel. Camille's heart pounded, her breath uneven, but she stood like stone. She wasn't just defending a seat. She was defending every time someone had told her she didn't belong, every moment someone had tried to silence her voice. The officers straightened, their hands tightening at their belts. The tension was unbearable, stretching the silence until it became a suffocating cage. Bradley chuckled again, muttering, "This is ridiculous. She's wasting everyone's time." His arrogance filled the space, his smirk daring her to break, daring her to surrender. But Camille did not. She thought of her employees depending on her, of the little girl inside her who had dreamed of being more than the world ever wanted her to be. She thought of all the quiet battles she had fought, and how this public humiliation was just the loudest echo of them all. Her voice broke the silence once more, soft but immovable. "You can take me off this plane if you wish, but the truth will not change. That is my seat. I belong here." For the first time, a ripple moved through the passengers, an uneasy shift, a few murmurs of agreement. It wasn't support, not fully, but it was recognition. The truth was too sharp now to be ignored. The officers hesitated. Bradley scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Unbelievable," he spat, but his confidence faltered ever so slightly as the moment dragged. Camille's chest rose and fell, her breath ragged but her stance unbroken. She felt the tears burning at the corners of her eyes, but she would not let them fall here, not in front of him, not in front of anyone. And then, just as the officer's hand twitched again toward her arm, the intercom crackled. The pilot's voice cut through the cabin, firm and commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. This flight will not be departing until I address a matter in first class." The words dropped like thunder. The cabin froze, the hum of whispers collapsing into silence. Bradley shifted in his seat, his smirk wavering. The officers stepped back slightly, uncertain. Camille's heart pounded, her eyes fixed on the cockpit door as it opened. The captain emerged, his expression unreadable, his presence filling the space with authority. And for the first time since the ordeal began, Camille felt the faint flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would finally see her. The captain's presence altered the air in the cabin in an instant. His steps were measured, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the tense scene before him. Every passenger who had been whispering moments before fell into silence, as though the very sound of authority had frozen them. Camille stood tall, though her chest rose and fell with sharp breaths. She could no longer disguise. The officers stepped back just enough to signal that someone higher had taken control, while Bradley Stone shifted in her seat, as though still confident he would be shielded by privilege. The captain's voice was steady, carrying a weight that silenced the last murmur in the cabin. "What is happening here?" Camille didn't hesitate. She lifted the crumpled boarding pass, her voice calm but trembling at the edges. "Captain, my name is Camille Davis. This is my seat. I have been told to move, told I don't belong here, while this man sits where my name is printed." The words were heavy, but her delivery was sharper than any protest could have been. She wasn't begging. She was stating the truth. And in that moment, it was impossible not to hear the exhaustion woven into her every syllable. Exhaustion from years of being asked to prove herself, when proof was already in her hands. The captain took the slip of paper, his eyes flicking from it to the tablet in Kelly Moore's hands. A beat of silence stretched, and then another. The sound of Camille's breath, unsteady and sharp, seemed to fill the cabin. Bradley shifted again, clearing his throat, finally daring to interrupt. She's mistaken. I've been here the whole time. She's holding us up. Just send her back where she belongs. His words spilled with the smugness of someone who had always been obeyed, who believed his voice was the final authority, but the captain's gaze was unyielding as it locked onto Bradley. He leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying the same weight as steel pressed against stone. Sir, your name is not on this seat assignment. You will remove yourself immediately. The words struck the cabin like a thunderclap. A wave of shock rippled through the passengers. Some gasped softly, others stared, but no one dared to move or speak. Bradley's confidence cracked, his mouth opening and closing as though the ground beneath him had shifted. This is outrageous, he sputtered, color rising in his face. You can't just. I can, the captain cut in, his tone sharp enough to slice the man's protest in half. You are delaying this flight. You will leave the aircraft now. He motioned to the officers, who stepped forward with renewed certainty, this time not toward Camille, but toward the man still clinging to the seat, as though it were his throne. Bradley tried to argue, his words tumbling over one another, but they sounded weak now, desperate. The smirk that had once mocked Camille was gone, replaced with the panic of a man stripped of his assumed authority. As the officers guided him up, the tension snapped like a rope stretched too tight. The passengers who had once hidden behind silence could no longer look away. Eyes widened, lips parted in disbelief, and the quiet scrape of Bradley's shoes against the carpet became the sound of justice finally taking form. Camille stood unmoving, her hands clenched, her body trembling not from fear but from the sheer intensity of the moment. She had been seconds away from being erased, and now she was standing in the very center of truth revealed. Bradley's protests carried down the aisle, mutters of "you'll regret this," and "this is ridiculous," falling flat against the walls of the plane. The officers ushered him out through the jet bridge, his voice fading until the cabin was quiet again. The captain turned back, his eyes resting on Camille, his expression softening, but not losing its authority. "Miss Davis," he said firmly, returning her boarding pass into her hand, "I apologize for what you've been put through. Please take your seat." Camille lowered herself into the leather chair, the place that had been hers all along, but she did so with a heaviness in her chest that no victory could erase. There was no triumph in this moment, no satisfaction in watching him go. Instead, there was the deep ache of knowing how close injustice had come to winning, how quickly her dignity could have been stripped away if the truth had not been forced into the light. She rested her hands on the armrest, her fingers still trembling, her breathing uneven. Around her, passengers slowly resumed their stillness, though now with the weight of what they had seen pressing down on them. Some glanced toward her with shame, others with reluctant acknowledgement, but no one spoke. The silence was no longer the silence of complicity. It was the silence of reflection. They had witnessed what it meant for someone to nearly be erased in plain sight, and now they could not unsee it. The captain gave one final nod to the crew and returned to the cockpit, his presence leaving behind a space filled with unspoken questions. Camille sat straight, her eyes fixed ahead, but inside her heart raced with conflicting emotions, relief, fury, sorrow, and the unshakable truth that this was not an isolated moment.
This was a reflection of battles she had fought her entire life, battles countless others fought without anyone stepping in. The engines roared faintly as the plane prepared once more for departure, but for Camille, the journey had already changed. The seat beneath her felt like both a victory and a wound, a reminder that even when justice came, it came too late and too hard won. She breathed in deeply, steadying herself. There was still more to face, not just on this flight, but in the world waiting beyond it. The engines finally hummed back to life. But for Camille Davis, the cabin still felt like a battlefield after the storm. She sat in 1A, her seat at last, yet the weight pressing against her chest was heavier than ever. The leather cushion beneath her didn't feel like a prize. It felt like a reminder of how close she had come to being erased, of how fragile dignity could feel in a world that never stopped questioning it. Around her, the passengers had quieted into uneasy silence. Some avoided her eyes altogether. Others offered brief glances heavy with guilt or curiosity, but not one voice rose to apologize for the role silence had played. The truth was, the flight hadn't just been delayed by one arrogant man, it had been delayed by every person who sat still and let cruelty breathe in the open. Camille's hands rested on her lap, fingers still trembling from the adrenaline rushing through her. She forced herself to breathe deeply, steadying the storm inside her chest. She thought of Bradley Stone's smirk, the way he had lounged in her seat, as if born entitled to it, and how quickly that confidence had turned to outrage when stripped of its shield.
The memory stung, but what stung even more was the sight of the flight attendants, Kelly Moore, who had hesitated too long, and Hannah Reed, who had said nothing when silence was an easier choice. Their discomfort was still visible as they moved down the aisle, their voices polite but brittle. They didn't meet Camille's gaze, as though eye contact would force them to confront the truth of what had unfolded. She leaned back, pressing her head lightly against the seat, but her thoughts did not settle. She remembered her father's words from years ago, spoken in a small kitchen with paint peeling at the edges. "You'll always have to work twice as hard to get half as much, Camille. And when they still doubt you, you'll stand taller anyway." Those words had carried her through college, through the sleepless nights of starting her company, through boardrooms where men twice her age whispered doubts when she wasn't meant to hear. Tonight, those words echoed louder than the engines outside. Passengers shifted in their seats, still uneasy, as though the air had thickened with something too uncomfortable to breathe. Camille felt the ache of loneliness settle in her chest, not because she needed anyone's approval, but because she had stood alone in a crowd of witnesses. That, she realized, was the cruelty that lingered longest. She closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself, reminding her heart that her worth was never measured by others' silence. When the pilot's voice returned over the intercom, it was calm and businesslike, but there was a weight behind it. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We will be departing shortly. On behalf of the crew, I extend my apologies for the delay." His words were simple, but to Camille they carried layers no apology could truly hold. The plane might take off now, but the truth of what had happened would remain grounded in every heart that had hid it. She opened her eyes and reached for the folder in her bag, the expansion documents she was traveling to sign. They felt heavier than usual in her hand, not because of the weight of paper, but because of the message she now carried with them. Tomorrow, when she stood before a room of executives waiting to measure her value in contracts and numbers, she would tell this story, not for sympathy, not for pity, but as a reminder that even at the highest levels, she was still asked to fight for her seat. And if she had to fight, she would make sure her fight meant something larger than herself. Her gaze flicked to the window, where the lights of the runway blurred against the night sky. She thought of the countless people who didn't have her platform, her voice, her resources to resist. How many had been told to move, to step aside, to wait quietly until their dignity was stripped bare? How many had simply accepted it because the fight was too heavy to carry? That thought pierced deeper than Bradley's words ever had. The engines roared louder, the plane inching forward, but Camille's focus was steady on the truth that this story wasn't ending with takeoff. It was only beginning. When she would stand tomorrow in her Navy suit, she wouldn't just speak about expansion and numbers. She would speak about what it meant to be silenced, about how injustice tried to disguise itself in politeness and procedure, and about how standing your ground could shift the very air in a room. Her hand pressed gently over her chest, feeling the rhythm of her heartbeat finally slowing. It wasn't pride that filled her now. It was resolve. She didn't want recognition or shallow gestures of compensation. She wanted reflection, A world where silence would no longer be the safest choice. A world where someone else wouldn't have to endure what she had just endured to prove they belonged in a seat already theirs. The plane's wheels began to roll, passengers leaning back into their seats as the cabin tilted with motion. But Camille sat straighter, her eyes forward, her heart carrying more than luggage into the skies. This wasn't just her story anymore. It was the echo of millions, a quiet demand for awareness carried higher than any altitude could reach. If this story moved you, don't just watch in silence. Show your support by liking this video and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe voices like Camille's deserve to be heard, make sure to subscribe so you never miss stories that matter. But tell me this, if you were on that plane, would you have spoken up or stayed quiet like the others? I'm waiting to read your answer in the comments.